There is a room inside your mind that you have never entered. It has no door you can see, no windows that let in familiar light. Most people walk past it every day of their lives, sensing its presence the way you sense a shadow moving at the edge of your vision. Something there, something not quite there. But some people, through circumstance or courage or catastrophic necessity, find themselves standing at its threshold. And what they discover on the other side changes everything they thought they knew about who they are. This room has many names across cultures and centuries. The mystics called it the dark night of the soul. Psychiatrists call it depersonalization, dissociation, or psychotic break. Shamans called it the initiation. Psychedelic researchers call it ego dissolution. Carl Jung called it the encounter with the shadow. But perhaps the most accurate name, the one that captures both its terror and its promise, is simply this: ego death. The moment when the self you have built, defended, and believed in for your entire life suddenly collapses like a tower of sand, revealing that it was never as solid as you imagined. Picture this. You are standing in a bathroom at 3 a.m, staring at your reflection in the mirror. But something is wrong. The face looking back at you, your face, the one you have seen every day for decades, suddenly seems foreign, constructed, false. You try to connect with it, to feel the familiar sense of me that has always been there, but instead you encounter an abyss. The continuity of self, that invisible thread that has woven your past into your present and promised a future, has snapped. Who is looking at whom? Which side of the mirror is real? And in that moment of vertigo, you understand with terrifying clarity, the person you thought you were is a fiction, a story, a ghost haunting a house of meat and electricity. This is not metaphor. This is not poetry. This is the lived reality of ego death, a psychological event so profound that it shatters the most fundamental assumption of human consciousness, the belief in a stable, continuous, independent self. But here is what makes ego death so paradoxical, so necessary, and so rarely understood. It is not an ending. It is a transformation. It is the mind's most radical act of renovation, tearing itself down to its foundations so it can rebuild according to a truer blueprint. It is psychological metamorphosis, and like the caterpillar dissolving into biological chaos inside the chrysalis, the process looks like death from the outside, but from the inside, it is the only path to flight. Tonight, we embark on a journey into the hidden architecture of consciousness itself. We will descend into the collapse, trace the origins of the ego, understand why the mind sometimes must destroy itself to survive, and discover what lies on the other side of identity's dissolution. This is not a journey for the faint of heart, because we will be exploring the very mechanism by which you experience being you, and we will watch as it falls apart. We will walk through ancient temples where shamans guided initiates through ego death as a rite of passage. We will enter modern laboratories where neuroscientists map the brain regions that generate the illusion of self. We will sit with patients in psychiatric wards experiencing the terror of depersonalization. We will journey with those who have taken psychedelics and returned from the other side of consciousness transformed. We will study the writings of mystics and philosophers who recognized that the death of the ego is not madness, but awakening. And we will ask the questions that matter most. What is the ego? Why does it exist? What happens when it dies? And perhaps most importantly, what becomes of us when we return from that death, carrying the memory of having been nothing and no one? The answers will challenge everything you think you know about consciousness, reality, and transformation. Because ego death is not just a psychological phenomenon. It is the secret technology of human evolution, the hidden mechanism by which consciousness transcends its limitations and glimpses something larger than itself. So let me ask you now, before we begin our descent, are you ready to question who you are? Are you prepared to discover that the self you defend so fiercely might be the very prison from which you need to escape? Can you endure the possibility that everything you call I might be a beautiful, necessary lie, and that only by seeing through that lie can you touch what is actually true? The room with no door is opening, the collapse is calling, and on the other side of this psychological death, something is waiting to be born. Let us begin. The construction of the ghost. Before we can understand the death of the ego, we must first understand its birth, because the ego is not something you were born with. It is something you built, layer by layer, memory by memory, trauma by trauma, from the moment you first opened your eyes in this world. And like all constructions, it can be deconstructed. Like all stories, it can be rewritten. Like all towers, it can fall. Let us travel back to the beginning, not to your beginning, but to the beginning of consciousness itself. The first mirror. Imagine the first human being who ever recognized themselves in their reflection. Perhaps it was in a still pool of water, the surface smooth as glass under a prehistoric sky. Every creature before that moment had looked into water and seen another creature, an enemy, a companion, prey, predator. But this human, through some mutation of awareness, some evolutionary spark, looked into the water and thought, "That is me." In that single moment, something extraordinary and terrible happened. Consciousness folded back on itself. The observer became the observed. The mind created a model of itself and then identified with that model so completely that it forgot the model was not the thing itself. The ego was born, a pattern of thought that says, "I am this and not that," a boundary drawn in the infinite field of awareness, a character in the story consciousness tells about itself. Neuroscientists now understand that this sense of self, this feeling of being a unified, continuous me located somewhere behind the eyes, is generated by a network of brain regions they call the default mode network. It is the brain's background hum, the narrator that never stops speaking, the one who claims authorship of your thoughts, ownership of your memories, and agency over your actions. It is the psychological software that runs constantly, maintaining the illusion of a separate self moving through space and time. But here is what the neuroscience reveals. This sense of self is not detecting something that exists. It is creating something that doesn't. The ego is not discovered. It is invented. It is not a thing. It is a process, a constant act of self-construction so seamless that we mistake it for reality itself. The philosopher David Hume recognized this centuries before brain scanners could prove it. He wrote that when he looked deeply into his own consciousness, searching for the self, he found only a bundle of perceptions in perpetual flux. He could find thoughts, sensations, emotions, memories, but never the thinker, the feeler, the one having the experiences. The self, he concluded, was a grammatical fiction, a convenient pronoun we use to organize our experiences, but which corresponds to no actual entity. The Buddha went even further. 25 centuries ago, he taught the doctrine of anatta, no self, the recognition that what we call I is actually a temporary configuration of 5 aggregates: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. These aggregates arise and pass away moment by moment, but the ego creates the illusion of continuity, like a movie projector creating the appearance of motion from a series of still frames. But if the ego is an illusion, why does it exist? Why would evolution create a consciousness that systematically deceives itself about its own nature? The purpose of the prison. The answer is both simple and profound: survival. In the brutal theater of natural selection, organisms need to distinguish self from non-self, inside from outside, me from not me. An animal that cannot recognize the boundary of its own body cannot protect it. A creature without a model of itself as a separate agent cannot pursue its own interests, flee danger, or navigate social hierarchies. The ego emerged because organisms with a sense of self survived and reproduced more successfully than those without one. As the human brain exploded in complexity, growing from instinct-driven to symbol-wielding, from reactive to reflective, from present-oriented to time-traveling. The ego became more elaborate. It extended backward through memory, creating a continuous narrative from birth to present. It projected forward through imagination, creating goals, fears, and fantasies. It became not just I am, but I was and I will be. It became not just a body, but a story, a character, a role in the social drama. The psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud mapped this territory with his structural model of the psyche. The id, he said, is the cauldron of unconscious drives, the raw, amoral energy of desire and aggression that seeks only satisfaction. The superego is the internalized voice of society, parents, and culture, the judge that demands conformity and punishes transgression. And caught between these two forces, mediating between desire and duty, reality and fantasy, is the ego, the executive function, the compromiser, the one who must navigate the impossible task of satisfying the id, appeasing the superego, and surviving in the actual world. Freud understood that the ego is essentially a defense mechanism, a psychological structure whose primary purpose is to manage anxiety, control impulses, and maintain the coherence of identity in the face of internal and external threats. The ego is, in his words, a poor creature owing service to three masters and consequently menaced by three dangers: the external world, the id, and the superego. But Carl Jung went deeper. He recognized that the ego is not just a mediator, it is also a mask. Jung introduced the concept of the persona, the social face we present to the world, derived from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient Greek theatre. The persona is not false, but it is partial. It is the edited version of ourselves we show to others, the role we play in the collective drama of society. And beneath the persona, Jung discovered what he called the shadow, all the aspects of ourselves we deny, repress, or reject because they do not fit the image the ego wants to maintain. The shadow contains not only our negative qualities, our rage, lust, envy, cowardice, but also our unrealized potential, our creative wildness, our authentic power. The ego, in its quest for safety and social acceptance, exiles the shadow into the unconscious, creating an internal division, a civil war within the self. So here is the paradox we must grasp. The ego is necessary but not real. It is useful but not true. It is a survival mechanism that becomes, over time, a prison of identity. It protects us from the overwhelming chaos of raw experience, but in doing so, it also separates us from the fullness of reality, from direct contact with what is actually happening. The ego is the skin that protects the wound, but also prevents the wound from healing. It is the story that makes sense of experience, but also traps us in a single interpretation. It is the lighthouse that helps us navigate, but also blinds us to everything beyond its beam. The architectures of identity. Let us examine how this architecture is constructed in each individual life. You did not emerge from the womb with an ego. The newborn infant exists in a state of what psychologists call oceanic consciousness, a boundless, undifferentiated awareness with no clear separation between self and other, inside and outside. The baby does not know where its body ends and the mother begins. It does not distinguish between its hunger and the world's hunger, its pain and the world's pain. It is pure experience without the experiencer, pure seeing without the seer. But gradually, through countless interactions and repetitions, the boundaries begin to form. The infant learns that this hand is mine, that hand is someone else's. This cry produces comfort, that cry produces nothing. Through pleasure and pain, reward and punishment, attention and neglect, the infant begins to construct a model of a separate self, an agent who can influence the world and must navigate its dangers. The developmental psychologist Margaret Mahler called this process separation individuation, the gradual emergence from symbiotic unity with the caregiver into autonomous selfhood. It is a necessary journey, but it is also a kind of exile, a departure from paradise into the burden of separateness. And as the child grows, the ego becomes more complex. Language arrives, that miraculous and catastrophic technology, and with it comes the ultimate tool of self-construction, the pronoun I. With language, the child can now refer to itself as an object, can narrate its own experience, can say, I want, I feel, I am. The self, which was once a wordless awareness, becomes a linguistic entity, a character in a story told in words. Culture adds its layers. Family tells the child who they are, good or bad, smart or stupid, lovable or burdensome. Society assigns roles and identities, gender, class, race, religion, each one another thread in the web of self-definition. Education shapes the ego's capacities and limitations. Trauma inscribes its wounds into the structure of identity. Success and failure, praise and criticism, love and abandonment, each experience adds to the architecture, strengthening some walls, weakening others. By the time we reach adulthood, the ego is a vast, intricate, seemingly solid structure. It is the sum total of our beliefs about who we are, our memories of what we have been, our hopes for who we might become. It is our personality, our habits, our values, our fears. It is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, a story so convincing that we forget it is a story at all. But what happens when that story stops making sense? What happens when the architecture can no longer support the weight of experience? What happens when the ego, faced with a reality it cannot integrate, begins to crumble? This is where our journey turns toward the darkness. Because for all its necessity, for all its elaborateness, the ego is fundamentally fragile. It is a structure built on assumptions, maintained by constant effort, vulnerable to disruption. And when the right conditions arrive, psychological pressure, existential crisis, traumatic dissolution, or mystical encounter, the ego does not simply bend. It breaks. And when it breaks, something extraordinary happens. Something terrifying and liberating. Something that looks like death, but might actually be birth. The shamans knew this. The mystics knew this. And now, finally, modern psychology is beginning to understand it too. In the laboratories of Johns Hopkins and Imperial College London, researchers are inducing ego death with psilocybin and studying what happens to consciousness when the default mode network goes offline. In meditation retreat centers, practitioners are spending months dissolving the boundaries of self. In psychiatric wards, patients are experiencing spontaneous ego dissolution, and some are returning from it, transformed. The message from all these sources is the same. The death of the ego is not the end of consciousness. It is the beginning of a different kind of consciousness, one that is larger, freer, more connected to the totality of existence. But to understand ego death, we must first witness it. We must descend into the collapse itself, feel its terror, map its territories, and discover what remains when the self dissolves into nothing. Are you ready? Can you let go of your certainty about who you are, even for a moment? Can you entertain the possibility that the most solid thing about you, your sense of being you, might be the most fluid? The ground beneath identity is about to open, and we are going to fall through it together. The collapse. There is a moment, impossible to predict and impossible to forget, when the ego realizes it is dying. It is a moment beyond words, beyond thought, beyond anything the rational mind can prepare for. It is the moment when the self looks into itself and finds nothing, when the observer becomes the void, and the void stares back. Let me take you there. The trigger. How collapse begins. Ego death does not announce itself with trumpets and warnings. It arrives suddenly, often catastrophically, triggered by experiences that overwhelm the mind's capacity to maintain the illusion of a stable self. Sometimes the trigger is obvious. A psychedelic substance flooding the brain with serotonin, dissolving the boundaries between self and world. Sometimes it is trauma, grief so profound that it shatters the story of who you were, abuse so devastating that it fractures identity into pieces. Sometimes it is spiritual practice, meditation so deep that awareness separates from the contents of consciousness and recognizes its own emptiness. But sometimes ego death arrives without any clear cause at all. It emerges from the accumulated pressure of 1,000 small betrayals, disappointments, and contradictions, until one day the structure simply cannot hold and collapses into itself like a dying star. Let us examine the pathways into this collapse. The psychedelic door. In 1943, a Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann accidentally absorbed a tiny amount of a substance he had synthesized 5 years earlier, lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD-25. What happened next would change the history of consciousness research forever. Hofmann experienced what he later called an extraordinary disruption of the ordinary self, a dissolution of the boundary between himself and the world, a collapse of time, a shattering of the ego structure. He wrote, "Everything in the room spun around, and the familiar objects and pieces of furniture assumed grotesque, threatening forms. The lady next door, whom I scarcely recognized, brought me milk. She was no longer Mrs. R., but rather a malevolent, insidious witch with a colored mask." But beyond the terror, Hofmann experienced something even more profound, a state of consciousness in which the self dissolved completely, leaving only pure, unfiltered awareness. He had stumbled into ego death. Since then, researchers have discovered that classic psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, DMT, mescaline, all work by disrupting the default mode network, the brain system responsible for self-referential thinking and the maintenance of ego boundaries. When this network quiets, the result is what researchers call ego dissolution, a temporary but profound loss of the sense of being a separate self. Studies using fMRI scans show that during psychedelic experiences, the rigid patterns of brain activity that usually separate different networks begin to break down. Regions that normally don't communicate begin talking to each other. The result is a state of global brain connectivity, a condition where consciousness expands beyond its usual boundaries, accessing information and experiences normally filtered out by the ego's gatekeeping function. Robin Carhart Harris, one of the leading researchers in this field, describes it as a movement from constrained cognition to entropic cognition, from the ordered, predictable patterns of ego consciousness to the chaotic, boundless awareness of ego death. He writes, "The ego dissolution experience is characterized by a loss of the sense of self-identity, a loss of one's sense of having a clear and distinct identity or self-location. But what does this actually feel like from the inside? Subjects consistently report similar phenomenology. First comes the loosening, a sense that the boundaries of self are becoming permeable, that the membrane between in here and out there is thinning. Then comes the disorientation. Time begins to fold and fracture, space becomes unstable, the familiar markers of identity start to disappear, and finally comes the dissolution itself, a complete loss of subject-object distinction, where there is no longer anyone experiencing anything, only experience experiencing itself. One research subject described it this way: "I was not gone, but I was gone." Awareness continued, but the one who is usually aware had disappeared. It was terrifying and liberating simultaneously, like dying while remaining alive to witness the death. The trauma door. But psychedelics are not the only pathway into ego death. Trauma can produce the same result through entirely different mechanisms. When the psyche encounters an experience too overwhelming to integrate, sexual abuse, the violent death of a loved one, combat trauma, a betrayal so complete it destroys trust, the ego sometimes fractures as a protective mechanism. Dissociation, that strange mercy of the mind, allows consciousness to separate from unbearable reality. But in extreme cases, dissociation can progress into depersonalization and derealization, states where the self becomes strange, unreal, dreamlike. Psychiatrists call this depersonalization-derealization disorder, but those who experience it describe something that sounds remarkably like ego death. looking at themselves from outside, feeling disconnected from their own thoughts and emotions, experiencing the world as flat, unreal, like a movie or a dream they cannot wake from. Consider the testimony of one patient. I would look at my hands and know intellectually that they were my hands, but I felt no connection to them. I would speak and hear my voice, but feel as though someone else was speaking through me. The person I had been seemed to have died, but my body continued operating on autopilot. Trauma researchers like Bessel van der Kolk have shown that severe trauma actually changes brain structure, particularly in regions associated with self-processing. The sense of a coherent, continuous self, already an illusion, becomes impossible to maintain. The ego, built on the assumption of safety and predictability, cannot survive the knowledge that the world is fundamentally unsafe and that those who should protect you might destroy you. In these cases, ego death is not chosen, it is forced. It is not transcendent, it is catastrophic. It leaves the person stranded in a territory beyond identity, unable to return to who they were, but not knowing how to move forward. The spiritual door. But there is another way into ego death, one pursued deliberately by mystics and contemplatives across every spiritual tradition, the path of meditation and spiritual practice. In Buddhist meditation, practitioners train attention to observe the arising and passing of mental phenomena with such precision that the illusion of a permanent self becomes impossible to maintain. They watch thoughts appear and disappear, emotions arise and dissolve, sensations come and go, and gradually recognize that there is no one to whom these experiences are happening. There is only the flow of experience itself, momentary and impermanent. Advanced practitioners report stages that sound identical to psychedelic ego dissolution. The contemporary meditation teacher Daniel Ingram describes the dark night of the soul, stages of insight meditation, periods where the sense of self becomes unstable, threatening, even terrifying. Practitioners experience anxiety, depression, and what feels like psychological disintegration. But those who continue through this territory emerge into what Buddhist psychology calls cessation, a moment where consciousness stops and restarts, having directly encountered the emptiness at the core of self. The Christian mystics describe the same process. St. John of the Cross wrote of the dark night of the soul, a period of spiritual desolation where God withdraws, leaving the practitioner in emptiness and meaninglessness, but he recognized this darkness as necessary, a stripping away of the false self, the ego's attachments and identifications, to make room for union with the divine. Meister Eckhart, the medieval mystic, went even further. The ultimate leaving is leaving God for God. He taught that even the concept of God must be surrendered, even the one who seeks God must die, for the final realization to occur. What remains after this death is not nothing, but everything, the eternal unborn awareness that was never created and can never be destroyed. The phenomenology of collapse, inside the death. Now let us enter the experience itself. Let us map the territory of collapse as it unfolds in consciousness. Stage 1. The crack in reality. It begins with a disturbance, a glitch in the matrix of ordinary consciousness. Something is wrong, but you cannot name what. The familiar world becomes subtly strange, as if you are seeing it for the first time or through a filter you cannot identify. Thoughts that usually flow smoothly become sticky, disconnected. The sense of being here and now becomes ambiguous. This is the ego's first awareness of threat. It responds with anxiety, the system's alarm bell, signaling that something has gone wrong. But the anxiety itself becomes part of the problem, creating a feedback loop. The more the ego tries to reassert control, the more it realizes control is slipping. Panic begins to rise. Stage 2. The loss of narrative coherence. Next, the story begins to break down. Your personal history, the narrative that connects your past to your present, that explains who you are and why you are, starts to lose its coherence. Memories become disconnected, floating free from the timeline. The future, which usually stretches ahead with plans and possibilities, collapses into an eternal, meaningless now. You try to anchor yourself with thought, with language, with memory, but the anchors are pulling loose. Questions that should have obvious answers become impossible to answer. Who am I? Where am I? What am I? The words themselves become strange, losing their meaning, turning into nonsense sounds. This is the phase researchers call thought disorder in pathological states and transcendence of conceptual thought in mystical states, but the phenomenology is identical. Language, that foundation of human consciousness, reveals itself as arbitrary, constructed, ultimately empty. Stage 3. The dissolution of boundaries. Now the membrane dissolves. The clear distinction between self and other, inside and outside, begins to blur and then disappear entirely. You might feel yourself expanding beyond the boundaries of your body, merging with the room, the building, the world. Or you might feel yourself shrinking to a point, then vanishing entirely. Physical boundaries become psychological boundaries. You cannot tell where your hand ends and the air begins. You cannot distinguish between your thoughts and the thoughts of others. The barrier between waking and dreaming collapses. You might feel as though you are multiple people, or no person at all. The sense of location, the feeling of being behind the eyes, looking out, simply ceases. Neuroscience suggests this happens when the posterior cingulate cortex and medial prefrontal cortex, key nodes in the default mode network, reduce their activity. These regions usually maintain the sense of an embodied self moving through space and time. When they go offline, so does the self. Stage 4. The encounter with the void. And then comes the core of the experience, the void itself, the emptiness at the heart of consciousness. This is not nothing. It is not absence. It is a fullness beyond form, a presence before identity, an awareness that has no object because it is not separate from anything to observe. Some describe it as infinite space, others as radiant darkness, others as overwhelming love or pure being. But all agree on this. It is a state of consciousness where there is no one who is conscious, only consciousness itself, luminous and empty. The Christian mystic Mechthild of Magdeburg called it the nothingness from which all creation springs. The Buddhist teacher Ajahn Chah called it the one who knows, awareness itself, prior to any particular knowledge. The philosopher Martin Heidegger called it being, the groundless ground of existence. But language here fails completely, because language requires a subject and object, a self who speaks about something other than itself. In ego death, that structure collapses. There is no one to report what is happening, because there is no longer a someone distinct from what is happening. Stage 5. The terror and the ecstasy. What makes ego death so overwhelming is that it contains both absolute terror and absolute ecstasy, often simultaneously. The terror is existential in the most literal sense. It is the confrontation with non-existence, the dissolution of everything you have ever identified as yourself. Every instinct screams against it. The survival mechanism that is the ego fights with everything it has to maintain coherence, to re-establish boundaries, to make meaning out of meaninglessness. Subjects describe feeling as though they are dying, going insane, being annihilated. They experience themselves as fragmenting into pieces, dissolving into chaos, falling into an abyss with no bottom. The panic can be overwhelming, a terror more profound than any fear of physical death, because it is the death of the one who would die. And yet, simultaneously, many describe profound peace, liberation, even joy. Because what dies in ego death is not consciousness. It is only the narrow, contracted, defended version of consciousness that we call the self. What remains is something larger, freer, more at home in the universe than the ego ever was. Ram Dass, the spiritual teacher who explored consciousness for decades, described it this way. In the depths of the void, I found I was not separate from anything. I was the ocean pretending to be a wave, and in that moment of recognition, the fear dissolved into laughter. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, the ancient guide for navigating death and ego dissolution, teaches that the terror and the ecstasy are two sides of the same experience. How you perceive it depends on your relationship to letting go. If you cling to the ego, the experience is hellish. If you surrender, it is liberating. The landscape of dissolution, maps from the mystics. Let us now examine the maps left by those who have traveled this territory before us. The ancient Egyptians had a map, the myth of Osiris, the god who was murdered, dismembered, and scattered across Egypt, and then reassembled and resurrected. This was not just mythology. It was a psychological map of ego death and rebirth. The dismemberment represents the fragmentation of identity, the scattering represents the dissolution of the self, and the reassembly represents the reconstruction of consciousness in a new form. The Greeks had their map too, the descent of Persephone into the underworld, where she was forced to remain for half of each year, transformed from maiden to queen of the dead. Psychologically, this is the journey into the unconscious, the shadow realm where the ego must die for wisdom to be born. The alchemists encoded it in their chemical allegories, the nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction, where the prima materia, the raw material of the self, must be broken down, dissolved, reduced to its essential components before the gold of transformation can emerge. Solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate, was their formula. First destruction, then reconstruction. Carl Jung recognized that these myths all described the same psychological process, what he called the individuation process, the journey toward wholeness that requires the death of the ego as the center of personality. Jung wrote, "There is no birth of consciousness without pain. The ego must be dethroned, relativized, seen as only one part of a larger whole. And this dethronement feels like death. But Jung also warned of the dangers. Ego death without proper preparation or integration can lead to psychosis, to inflation, to a kind of spiritual bypassing where the person identifies with the archetypal realm and loses all ground in ordinary reality. The goal is not to destroy the ego, but to transform it, to move from ego as tyrant to ego as servant, from ego as the whole of consciousness to ego as one function within a larger psyche. The psychiatrist Stanislav Grof, who spent decades researching non-ordinary states of consciousness, identified what he called systems of condensed experience, or coexes, layers of psychological material organized around specific themes and emotional charges. In deep psychological work, these coexes can surface and overwhelm the ego, producing experiences indistinguishable from ego death. But Grof argued that this is actually the psyche's attempt to heal itself, bringing repressed material to the surface so it can be integrated. He identified 3 levels of unconscious material: the biographical, personal history and trauma, the perinatal, birth trauma, and the transition from womb to world, and the transpersonal, archetypal, collective, and spiritual experiences. In profound ego-death experiences, people often move through all 3 levels, encountering their personal shadow, re-experiencing birth and death, and touching something that feels ancient, cosmic, sacred. When the collapse becomes chronic, the dark side. But we must also confront the shadow side of ego-death, when the collapse does not resolve into rebirth, but becomes chronic, pathological, imprisoning. Depersonalization disorder can persist for years, trapping people in a strange state between existence and non-existence. They feel themselves to be not real, watching their lives from a distance, unable to reconnect with the felt sense of being alive. Unlike mystical ego death, which is temporary and transformative, chronic depersonalization is a living death. Neither the relief of non-being nor the vitality of being, but a grey limbo in between. Schizophrenia can involve persistent ego-boundary dissolution, where the self bleeds into the world and the world bleeds into the self, producing confusion, paranoia, and terror. Without the filter of a coherent ego, Consciousness is flooded with too much information, too many perspectives, too many voices. The result is not enlightenment but fragmentation. The difference between transformative ego death and pathological ego dissolution often comes down to factors like mindset, setting, environment, preparation, and integration. The same experience that liberates one person might traumatize another. The key is not the dissolution itself, but what happens afterward, whether consciousness can reconstruct itself in a more integrated way, or whether it remains broken. The philosopher and psychologist William James recognized this over a century ago. He studied religious and mystical experiences and concluded that their value lies not in the experience itself, but in their fruits, how they change a person's life, values, and relationships. An ego death that leads to greater compassion, wisdom, and integration is transformative. One that leads to isolation, inflation, or disconnection from reality is destructive. This is why indigenous cultures that use psychedelics for ego death experiences always embedded them in ritual, community, and tradition. The shaman did not just give you the medicine and leave you alone. They guided you through, interpreted the visions, helped you integrate the experience into your life and community. The ego death was not the end, but the beginning of a long process of transformation. The point of no return. There comes a moment in every ego death, the moment of complete surrender or complete resistance. This is the point of no return, the threshold where you must choose, though you are already dissolving and choice itself becomes strange. Do you let go completely, trusting the process even as everything familiar disappears? Or do you cling to the wreckage of identity, trying to salvage something, anything, to prove you still exist? The mystics all agree. Resistance creates suffering, surrender creates liberation. But surrender to ego death is perhaps the hardest thing consciousness can do, because it requires the ego to cooperate in its own dissolution, a logical and psychological impossibility that somehow in the crisis moment becomes possible. Zen calls it the great death. Sufism calls it fana, annihilation in the divine. Christianity calls it dying to the self. All point to the same event. The moment when you stop trying to be someone and discover what remains when no one is there. And what does remain? Awareness. Pure, unbound awareness, no longer constrained by the narrow spotlight of ego consciousness. Presence. Being itself, no longer filtered through the story of a separate self. Emptiness that is simultaneously fullness, void that is simultaneously source, death that is simultaneously birth. But this realization does not happen in some abstract realm. It happens in you, in the meat and electricity of your brain, in the biochemistry of your body, in the lived moment of your consciousness encountering itself without mediation. The question is, what happens after? When the collapse is complete, when the ego has died and awareness remains, can you come back? And if you do, what do you bring with you? Who or what returns from the other side of identity? This is where our journey turns from descent to ascent, from death to rebirth, from collapse to reconstruction, because ego death is not the end of the story. It is the middle, the crisis point that makes transformation possible. Let us now discover what lies on the other side of dissolution. After the collapse comes the return. After the death comes the resurrection. But what returns is never quite what left, because you cannot visit the void and come back unchanged. You cannot see through the illusion of self and then pretend it is solid again. You cannot die while alive and then forget you have died. This is the paradox of ego death. It is temporary, but its effects are permanent. The ego returns. It must for you to function in the world, but it returns transformed, loosened, seen through. And in that seeing through lies the possibility of a different way of being human. Let us explore the territory of return, the architecture of reconstruction, the gifts and dangers of having touched the infinite, the biochemistry of transformation. First, let us understand what happens in the brain during and after ego death, because this is not just philosophy, It is neuroscience. Research shows that psychedelic-induced ego dissolution produces lasting changes in brain structure and function. Brain scans of people who have experienced ego death show increased neural plasticity, new connections forming between brain regions that don't normally communicate. It is as if the brain has been shaken loose from its habitual patterns and given permission to reorganize itself. Robin Carhart Harris describes this as a movement from high entropy during the experience, where normal brain patterns break down into chaos, to increased repertoire afterward, where the brain has access to more states, more perspectives, more ways of processing information. The default mode network, which had gone offline during ego dissolution, comes back online, but not quite the same. It is less rigid, less dominating, more integrated with other networks. This neuroplasticity explains something remarkable. A single ego death experience can sometimes produce psychological changes that years of therapy could not. Depression lifts, anxiety decreases, addiction loses its grip. The fixed patterns of thought that kept people trapped suddenly become fluid again. Studies from Johns Hopkins and Imperial College London have shown that a single high-dose psilocybin session, carefully prepared and guided, can produce significant decreases in depression and anxiety that last for months or even years. The key factor is not just the chemical, but the ego death itself. Those who rate their experience as including complete ego dissolution show the greatest therapeutic benefit. Why? Because ego death reveals that the self you thought was so solid and permanent is actually flexible, constructed, changeable. And if the self is changeable, so are the patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior that you thought were just who you are. Depression says, I am worthless and always will be. Ego death says, there is no permanent I to be worthless, only patterns that can change. But the brain changes are not automatic. They require integration, conscious effort to incorporate the insights from ego death into daily life, to let the experience change not just your neurology, but your psychology, relationships, and way of being in the world. The return of the witness, reconstructing consciousness. When you come back from ego death, the first thing you notice is that you have come back at all. There is, once again, a you reading these words, thinking thoughts, having experiences. The ego has reconstructed itself. The narrator has resumed narrating. The sense of I has returned. But something has changed. There is now a subtle but profound distance between awareness and identity. You know, in a way you did not before, that the self is something consciousness is doing, not something consciousness is. You can watch the ego at work, watch it constructing stories, defending boundaries, seeking validation, and recognize, oh, that's just the ego doing its thing. That's not what I actually am. This is what the Buddhists call the witness consciousness, or bare attention. Awareness that observes the contents of experience without identifying with them. The thoughts arise, but you are not only the thoughts. The emotions arise, but you are not only the emotions. The story of self arises, but you are not only the story. The philosopher Ken Wilber describes this as the difference between I and I, the ego self and the witness self. The ego says, I am angry, I am afraid, I am worthy or worthless. The witness says, there is anger arising, there is fear arising, there is a thought about worth or worthlessness arising. The shift is subtle but transformative, from being the content of consciousness to being the space in which content arises. After ego death, this witness perspective is no longer just a philosophical concept. It is a lived reality. You have directly experienced consciousness without content, awareness without object, being without identity. And that experience remains as a kind of knowing that cannot be unknown, a seeing that cannot be unseen. The Indian sage Ramana Maharshi taught that the purpose of spiritual practice is not to achieve some future state, but to recognize what you already are, the pure awareness that witnesses all experience but is never touched by it, never changed by it, never born and never dying. Ego death, in his view, is simply the direct recognition of this timeless awareness, not a special state, but the realization of the natural state that was always here, underneath the noise of ego. The integration crisis, the danger of the return. But here is the challenge. Ego death can be experienced in one of two ways, as liberation or as annihilation, as mystical union or as psychotic break. And the difference often depends not on the experience itself, but on what happens afterward. Some people return from ego death inflated, convinced they have achieved enlightenment or special knowledge that others lack. They might develop what psychiatrists call spiritual bypassing, using spiritual concepts to avoid dealing with real psychological issues, real trauma, real responsibility. They might become detached in an unhealthy way, using the "it's all an illusion" insight to justify emotional avoidance or ethical carelessness. Jung warned about this danger, calling it inflation, when the ego identifies with the archetypal realm it encountered during dissolution. Instead of the ego being relativized and humbled, it becomes grandiose, believing it has transcended ordinary human limitations. I saw God becomes I am God. I experienced no self becomes I am more enlightened than others. The experience that should have dissolved the ego's supremacy instead reinforces it in a new, more subtle form. This is why every wisdom tradition emphasizes that ego death is not the destination, but the beginning. Buddhism speaks of post-enlightenment practice, the years of work that come after initial awakening to stabilize and embody the insight. The Zen saying goes, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The experience changes everything and nothing. You still have to live, work, relate, take responsibility. The key to healthy integration is what psychologists call ego strength, a strong enough sense of self to withstand dissolution without fragmenting, and to return from dissolution without inflating. Paradoxically, you need a healthy ego to transcend the ego. Without it, ego death becomes not transformation, but trauma. This is why indigenous shamanic traditions were so careful about who was ready for ego-dissolving experiences and when. Not everyone should confront the void at every moment. There is a time for building the self and a time for seeing through it. The tragedy of the modern Western encounter with ego death, through psychedelics taken without guidance or preparation, is that it often comes too early, too suddenly, without the cultural or psychological container to hold the experience. The gifts of having died, what changes afterward. But for those who integrate the experience skillfully, ego death can catalyze profound transformation across every dimension of life. The gift of perspective. First, you gain perspective on your own psychology. The patterns that once seemed like just who I am now reveal themselves as habits, conditioned responses, inherited scripts. You can see the ego at work without being completely caught in it. This creates space to choose differently, respond rather than react, interrupt old cycles. The depressed person who has experienced ego death might still have depressive thoughts, but now there is a witness who can notice. Oh, the depression is here again, telling its familiar story. And in that noticing, a gap opens, a moment of choice where the old pattern doesn't have to run automatically. The gift of compassion. Second, you gain compassion for yourself and others. Because if your own sense of self is revealed as constructed, fragile, and ultimately empty, how can you not extend understanding to others who are trapped in the same beautiful, necessary illusion? The ego's harshness towards self and others softens when you realize everyone is doing their best to maintain a sense of self that is fundamentally groundless. The spiritual teacher Ram Dass said that after his first ego death experience, he looked at everyone he met and thought, "Oh, you're just consciousness in drag, pretending to be separate, playing the game of being a person. How beautiful, how hilarious, how compassionate." The gift of presence. Third, you gain presence, the capacity to be here now, without the constant narration and interpretation that the ego usually provides. Because you have experienced awareness without thought, being without story, you know it is possible. And in moments of stillness, you can return to that state, not as profound as full ego death, but as a taste of the freedom that lies beneath identity. Meditation becomes easier after ego death because you have directly experienced what meditation is pointing toward. You are no longer trying to achieve some abstract state. You are remembering something you have already touched. The practice becomes less striving, more allowing. The gift of fearlessness. Fourth, and perhaps most profound, you gain a different relationship with death itself, because you have already died, not physically, but psychologically. You have faced the ultimate fear, the dissolution of self, and discovered that awareness does not end when the ego ends. You know, in a way the intellectual mind cannot fully grasp that what you truly are cannot be destroyed. This does not make you immortal or immune to loss and grief, but it removes the existential terror that underlies so much human suffering. The fear that when you die, everything goes dark, all that you are will be erased, the universe will forget you. After ego death, you know that the you who fears erasure was never as real as it seemed, and the awareness that witnessed that you, that is witnessing these words right now, is not contained by the boundaries of personality or time. The Tibetan Book of the Dead teaches that learning to die consciously through ego death in life is the best preparation for actual death. If you have already learned to let go of the ego, to rest in bare awareness, to surrender into the unknown, then the transition of physical death becomes not a catastrophe, but a familiar territory. The neuroscience of awakening, DMT and the dying brain. Here is something extraordinary that science has recently discovered. The dying brain naturally produces DMT, the most potent ego-dissolving psychedelic known. Rick Strassman's research suggests that the pineal gland may release DMT at the moment of death, creating a natural ego-death experience as consciousness departs the body. This raises a startling possibility. Perhaps evolution built ego-death into the very process of dying. Perhaps the dissolution of self at death is not a bug, but a feature, a final gift from biology, a natural psychedelic mercy that helps consciousness let go, dissolve the boundaries that kept it individuated, and return to whatever comes next. Near-death experiences, NDEs, often share phenomenology with psychedelic ego death. The sense of leaving the body, encountering a brilliant light, experiencing unconditional love and acceptance, feeling connected to everything, reviewing one's life from outside the usual perspective. Some researchers now believe these experiences might be produced by endogenous DMT release, the brain's final fireworks as the ego surrenders. But you do not have to wait for death to access this state. Meditation, psychedelics, intense spiritual practice. These are technologies for dying while alive, for experiencing the death that awaits us all and discovering what lies on the other side. The evolution of consciousness, beyond the ego. Now let us zoom out to the largest possible context, the evolution of consciousness itself. Because ego death is not just an individual phenomenon, it may be a crucial stage in humanity's collective awakening. For most of human history, consciousness was embedded, identified completely with its contents, believing its thoughts were reality, its perceptions were truth, its identity was solid. This is what the philosopher Jean Gebser called archaic and magical consciousness, pre-egoic awareness, not yet self-reflective. Then came the emergence of the ego, the ability to stand apart from experience and say, "I think, therefore I am." This was Descartes' great insight and great mistake. Great because it recognized self-aware consciousness, mistaken because it turned consciousness into a thing, a substance, a ghost in the machine. Modern consciousness is ego consciousness. We experience ourselves as separate subjects observing and acting upon an objective world. This creates tremendous power: science, technology, rational thought, individual agency. but it also creates profound alienation from nature, from each other, from our own depths, from the sacred dimension of existence. Some philosophers and consciousness researchers believe we are now in a transition to what they call post-egoic or integral consciousness, a stage where the ego is not destroyed but transcended and included, where we can use the ego's functions without being imprisoned by its boundaries. This is what Wilber calls vision logic, or integral awareness, the capacity to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, to see both the relative truth of the ego and the absolute truth of its emptiness. Ego death is one of the primary technologies for catalyzing this shift. It allows individuals to experience directly what philosophers and mystics have been trying to explain for millennia: that consciousness is not produced by the brain, contained by the ego, or limited to the individual. Consciousness is the ground of being itself, and what we call I is a temporary localization of something infinite, like a wave temporarily distinct from the ocean. The technologies of transformation, old and new. Throughout history, humans have developed technologies for inducing ego death and expanding consciousness. Let us briefly survey this toolkit. Ancient technologies, shamanic drumming and dancing to exhaustion, creating altered states, fasting and sensory deprivation, removing the ego's usual supports, sacred plants like ayahuasca, peyote, psilocybin mushrooms, meditation and contemplative practices, ritual, death and rebirth initiations, chanting and breath work, altering brain chemistry, modern technologies, clinical psychedelic therapy with professional guidance, advanced meditation techniques from Buddhist and Hindu traditions, isolation tanks and sensory deprivation, holotropic breathwork developed by Stanislav Grof, virtual reality experiences that simulate ego dissolution, neurofeedback training to quiet the default mode, network. What is significant is that all these technologies, ancient and modern, plant and synthetic, ritual and clinical, converge on the same target: the temporary dissolution of the ego to allow for psychological healing and transformation. And now we stand at an unprecedented moment in history. For the first time, we have both scientific understanding of how ego death works neurologically and legal, clinical access to the tools for inducing it safely. Psychedelic research is experiencing a renaissance. Meditation has moved from monasteries to mainstream. Neuroscience is mapping the brain correlates of mystical states. We are developing, collectively, a new understanding. The ego is neither enemy nor master, but a tool. It is necessary for navigating the world, but it is not the totality of who we are. Learning to let it die and be reborn, repeatedly, consciously, intentionally, may be the next stage in human psychological evolution. The perennial philosophy, the truth that ego, death reveals. There is a pattern that appears across every culture, every wisdom tradition, every genuine mystical experience throughout history. Aldous Huxley called it the perennial philosophy, the universal insights that arise when consciousness encounters itself beyond the ego. The insights are these. 1. Consciousness is not produced by the brain, but expressed through it. Awareness is fundamental, not derivative. 2. The separate self is an illusion, useful, necessary, but ultimately empty. What we truly are is consciousness itself, temporarily localized but never truly separate from the whole. 3. All things are interconnected in a vast web of relationship. Subject and object, self and other, are distinctions within a fundamental unity. 4. Love is not an emotion, but the recognition of unity, seeing yourself in the other because at the deepest level there is no other. 5. Death is a transition, not an ending. What you truly are was never born and will never die. These are not beliefs or philosophies. They are reported as direct experiences during ego death. The mystic, the meditator, the psychedelic voyager, the person having a near-death experience, all report variations of the same core insights. This suggests something extraordinary, that ego death does not reveal something new, but removes the obscuration that prevented us from seeing what was always true. It is not an achievement, but an uncovering, not a construction, but a recognition. As the Zen saying goes, before enlightenment, mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers. During enlightenment, mountains are not mountains and rivers are not rivers. After enlightenment, mountains are again mountains and rivers are again rivers. The world looks the same after ego death, but you see it differently. You see it as it is, not through the distorting lens of a separate self, but as the self-display of consciousness, as the universe experiencing itself through this particular localization we call you, the art of living after dying. So how does one live, having died and returned? This is the real work, the lifelong integration of the insight that transcends life. The answer is both simple and impossibly complex. You live with lightness and commitment, detachment and engagement, knowing it is all empty and treating it as if it is all sacred. You continue playing the game of being a person, but now you know it is a game. You take your responsibilities seriously, but not your identity seriously. You care deeply about the world, while knowing the world is a dream. You act with full conviction, while holding all your beliefs lightly. This is the razor's edge, and it is easy to fall off. Fall one way into nihilism. Nothing matters. It's all illusion. Why bother? Fall the other way into spiritual bypassing. It's all perfect, all one. No need to address suffering or injustice. The middle path requires constant balance, constant recalibration. Zen master Suzuki Roshi expressed it perfectly. Everything is perfect as it is, and there is always room for improvement. You honor the ego as a useful fiction while not being ruled by it. You engage with the world fully while not forgetting its dreamlike nature. You build, create, love, strive, and you do it all with one hand, holding the other hand open in surrender to the ultimate emptiness of it all. This is the art of living after dying. It is not a destination you reach, but a practice you inhabit, moment by moment, for the rest of your life. And perhaps, just perhaps, death itself becomes not an ending you fear, but a transition you have already practiced, because you have already learned the art of letting go, of surrendering into the unknown, of dying while remaining aware. When the final ego death arrives, when the body stops and consciousness makes its ultimate transition, you will have been there before. You will know the territory, and you will be able to let go with grace, dissolving into the light or the void or whatever comes next, recognizing it as just another form of what you already are and have always been. The ego dies many times before the body dies once, and each death is a rehearsal, a preparation, a gift. Let us return now from this journey through dissolution and rebirth. Let us gather the wisdom we have found and carry it back into the ordinary world, which is also extraordinary, also sacred, also the place where consciousness learns to know itself. We have traveled together through the architecture of identity, watched it collapse into the void, and witnessed what emerges when consciousness reconstructs itself after death. We have traced ego death from ancient initiations to modern neuroscience, from mystical dissolution to clinical transformation, from terror to liberation and back again. So let us ask now, what have we learned? What do we carry forward? What changes in us when we understand that the self is both necessary and illusory, both everything and nothing, both the prison and the key? Here is the synthesis. The ego is a survival mechanism that became an identity prison. It emerged to help us navigate the world, but we forgot it was a tool and mistook it for what we are. Most of human suffering comes from defending, maintaining, and identifying with this constructed self, from the gap between who we think we should be and who we think we are, from the fear of not being enough or being too much, from the terror of impermanence and the certainty of death. Ego death, whether through psychedelics, trauma, meditation, or crisis, temporarily dissolves this structure and reveals what lies beneath. Awareness itself, pure and unconditional, not produced by the ego but obscured by it. And in that dissolution, Consciousness touches something it cannot touch when filtered through the ego, the direct experience of being, the interconnection of all things, the recognition that separation is the illusion and unity is the truth. But ego death is not the end of the path. It is the beginning. The real work is integration, embodiment, learning to live with one foot in emptiness and one foot in form, honoring both the relative truth of the self and the absolute truth of no self. This is the future of human consciousness, not the destruction of the ego, but its transformation, not the abandonment of individuality, but its contextualization within a larger wholeness, not the escape from being human, but the full embrace of what being human actually means. Consciousness temporarily forgetting itself so it can have the joy and terror and beauty of rediscovering itself. We live in a time of collective ego death. The old stories of endless progress, dominance over nature, the separated self as the highest achievement, are collapsing under their own contradictions. Climate crisis, technological disruption, social fragmentation, these are the symptoms of a civilization whose ego can no longer hold. And just as individual ego death can lead either to psychosis or awakening, collective ego death can lead either to catastrophe or transformation. The choice depends on whether we cling to the old structure as it crumbles, or whether we have the courage to let it die and trust what wants to emerge. The technologies of consciousness, meditation, psychedelics, contemplative practice are not escapes from the world's problems, but tools for developing the consciousness capable of addressing them. Because the problems we face are not technical, but psychological and spiritual. They arise from the illusion of separation, from nature, from each other, from future generations, and they can only be solved by consciousness that has seen through that illusion. Ego death, then, is not just personal healing, it is planetary necessity. It is the doorway to the consciousness we need to survive and flourish in the century ahead. So here is my invitation to you. You do not need to seek ego death. It will find you when you are ready, when life creates the conditions for collapse. But you can prepare for it. You can build the ego's strength to withstand it. You can develop the practices that make transformation more likely than trauma. You can learn to watch your own mind, to recognize thoughts as thoughts rather than truth, to see the ego constructing itself moment by moment. You can practice letting go of opinions, identities, the need to be right, the fear of being wrong. You can cultivate the witness, the awareness that observes all experience without being defined by it. And when collapse comes, and it will, in small ways every day and large ways eventually, you can meet it not as enemy but as teacher, not as ending but as opening, not as death but as transformation. The room with no door is not elsewhere. It is here always, underneath the constant construction of self, and the collapse, when it comes, is not disaster, it is homecoming. The question that remains. I leave you with this question, and I invite you to sit with it not as a puzzle to solve but as a koan to inhabit. If the self you have built your entire life is revealed as empty, if everything you identify as you is seen to be a temporary construct in the flow of consciousness, if who you are is not what you thought at all, then what remains? And what becomes possible when you live from that remainder, that awareness beyond identity, that consciousness that was never born and can never die? Who are you when you are no one? What can you become when you stop trying to be anything? What does the universe see when it looks through your eyes, no longer obscured by the story of me? The ego will return. It is returning even now, as you hear these words, as the narrator in your head comments and interprets and tries to understand. Let it return. Welcome it back. But remember that you have seen through it. Remember that you have died and lived to tell the tale. And in that remembering lies freedom. The freedom to be fully human while knowing you are also more than human. The freedom to play the game of being a person while knowing it is a game. The freedom to love this world fiercely while holding it lightly. The ego will die many more times before your final breath. Each time, it is an opportunity to release, to transform, to expand into the spaciousness that you are. May you meet each small death with grace. May you surrender into the great death with trust. And may you discover, in the space between who you were and who you will become, the consciousness that was never born and will never die, the eternal witness, the silent seer, the awareness that reads these words and knows itself in the reading. You are not who you think you are. You are the one who thinks. And beyond even that, you are the awareness in which thinking arises and passes away, like clouds in an empty sky. This is the gift of collapse. This is the wisdom of ego death. This is the technology of awakening that humanity has been developing for millennia and is only now beginning to fully understand. The journey is yours. The death is yours. The transformation is yours. And on the other side, which is also this side, which is also right here, right now, awaits something more beautiful and terrible and real than any self could ever be. Welcome to the other side of identity. Welcome to the consciousness that never dies. Welcome home to what you have always been. The ego death process is complete, and the awakening has only just begun.